Hello, everybody from the team. I'm going to just give you guys a quick walkthrough of how to use the new clusters backend. So, first things first, the clusters CRUD. So that's implemented the same way that the rest of the CRUD in the application is implemented, with a create cluster, delete cluster, all of that stuff. But you shouldn't really have to work with that too much. Filippo will be the one doing that. Clusters right now, they have a ID, a name, and a color. I believe that is it. We might add other things like an icon and some other variables, but right now that's everything that's implemented in the back end. So accessing data. So if you want to filter through everything that you were if we go back to the old system where we were using workspace for everything, if you had a function that took in a workspace ID and would find every entity that was related to that workspace, that's been implemented in the new system as well. So we've just renamed the workspace ID to be Studio ID and a cluster ID. So if you just provide a studio ID, it'll get everything in a studio. And if you just provide a cluster, or if you provide also a cluster ID, then it'll just get everything in that cluster. So if you want to add one of your entities to a cluster, you can use the add item to cluster mutation, and that's written out right here. So the studio ID, so you have to provide a studio ID and a cluster ID. Then you have to provide a item ID. So that's going to be the ID that you're using in the backend. So if it's a calendar or to-do or a workspace page or like an article, all of that stuff, you just have to send it, or you just have to provide that ID. And then the item type, that's an enum that contains both workspace pages, workspace folders, events, to-dos, goals, feeds, all of that stuff is all in that item type. And then it's just a large switch statement that runs through all the possibilities of this item type's enum and will give you the correct information, and we'll add it to the cluster. So that's just a nice universal function that I wrote so that we didn't have to write it out for every single thing. But yeah. So how to add somebody to a cluster. So I'll just start off first with, if you want to add somebody to a cluster and they aren't already in the main studio, you just have to use the create membership function. So or you'd have to invite them, and using the old system, so just being able to send them an invite via email, and once they receive that invite and accept it, then that'll create a membership in the back end. But if that membership has already been created, then you can add another cluster to a person's membership. So a cluster ID, so you can provide a studio ID and a cluster ID. If the studio ID is whenever that studio ID changes, but it'll just take the cluster ID, it'll add that to the person's membership, and we'll return the cluster like we said right here. So that should be everything you have to know. That's at least all the base stuff for implementing things in the front end. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I'll be here all day. So thank you for watching this. Bye.